Okay, welcome everybody, and I'm happy you are joining us here this evening. This presentation is filmed and recorded live on Monday evening, which is actually the close of Labor Day weekend. So if you're watching this live, well done to you. I'm very happy that you are showing up. And this is one of the reasons that we record these classes, because we realize that maybe people have different plans at different times. And yet over these last 6 months, we have certainly learnt what it means to be able to turn on a screen and catch up on something which we didn't see take place live. So I am going to talk to you this evening about a very important topic. This is part of our mini series that we are having, our lecture series on the subject, the three most important conversations, the three most important relationships you are going to have. And last week we looked at the topic of between yourself and others. And this week we're going to look at the very important subject of between yourself and God. Fascinating and important idea. We oftentimes don't think about God. We oftentimes don't speak about God. And in our religion, we almost marginalize God off to the side. Sometimes there is a great quote from Stephen Covey in his 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. He says, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. Isn't that a beautiful quote? I'll say that again. It's worthy of putting on your fridge. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. I might just give a Yom Kippur sermon on that, actually. It's such an important idea. And I think that to a greater degree, God is the main thing in Judaism. Can we keep God as the main thing? And the truth of the matter is, it's been very challenging at this season, especially over the last 6 months, to find God, to even be in a relationship with him. Why? All because of a small, tiny, little thing, which is as follows. Let me just share my screen with you, and you'll see that this has been what has taken up so much of our time. You are looking at a highly magnified version of the coronavirus, COVID-19. We still don't have a vaccine. We are still not able to hand out any type of protection for this. I was reading an article over the weekend, over Shabbat, that said that this concept of being 2 meters away from somebody was practiced 200 years ago, and that was their best guess for how to stay safe. And times really haven't changed much in terms of what it is that we've been able to do when we want to protect ourselves. This here is a magnified version of the coronavirus. And when you have that type of reality that we have been dealing with, a global pandemic, then questions arise and questions abound. And amazingly, if you take a look at the Talmud, one of the first questions that Moses asks of God when he is up on Mount Sinai, the Torah tells us that God granted him 3 requests. Classic genie in a bottle reality. You can ask me any 3 questions whatsoever, and I will provide you an answer. One of Moshe's questions that he asks of God is, I'll read it in the Hebrew, it's so beautiful, straight from Gemara Brachot. The Gemara says as follows, Brachot 7a, Zayin Amud Aleph. Amar lefanav, Ribono shel olam, Moshe said before God, Master of the universe, Mipnei ma yesh sadik v'ra'la, v'mipnei ma sadik v'tovla. Why are there righteous people that sometimes do very well in this world, and yet there are other righteous people that at times do very poorly in this world? There are righteous people and they suffer. In other words, the classic problem of evil. Why is there evil in this world? And not just evil for the wicked, there is even evil for the righteous. How are we to square this? How are we to come to an understanding? And God's response, be quiet. I'm not giving you an answer. This is what has come up in front of my mind. And if you push me on this issue, I'm going to have to undo the foundations of the world and we'll start over again. Be quiet. Now that's not very satisfying. God is basically telling Moshe, too bad, tough. I'm not going to tell. You ask, I'm not telling. And that really leaves us with a question. How are we supposed to have a relationship with God? We look out at the world, we see the devastation that this global pandemic has caused, and what room has that left for us to now be engaged in a relationship with Him? I wanted to start off tonight's lecture looking at some of the classic arguments that are made for faith itself, both in favor and against. I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes on this because it doesn't get to the heart of building the relationship. And it needs to be said at the outset, if a person is committed to an atheist philosophy that there is no God, I don't think any of the suggestions, not sure we can call them proofs anymore in the modern period, but many of these suggestions are not going to make a bit of difference to such a classically committed atheist. And actually, this is how Rav Wolber opens up a discussion about the existence of God. He says, it is possible to prove that 2 + 2 = 4 in an absolute way, but there is no such proof as to the existence of God, or the thousands of proofs still leave within man's hands the free will to believe or not to believe. Belief is built internally, meaning by the individual's deliberate choice. Very, very interesting. There is a sense that no matter what arguments are put forward, we can't prove with a certainty the existence of God. And that's done on purpose, argues Rabbi Wolber. Rabbi Wolber was a great rabbi of the previous century. And that gets to the heart of this issue. Our relationship with God is one of precisely that relationship. We try to build it. We try to create it in a way that it's not forced upon us. It's not something that is manifest in an essential way that it has to be and we have to believe. But rather, there's room to explore. There's room to question. There's room to say, perhaps there could be a God, and perhaps there could be a relationship. And yet we know at the same time that that's not always the approach taken. I'd like to read to you the famous atheist, angry atheist, Richard Dawkins, taken from his book, The Improbability of God. And look what he says. The teleological argument is an argument that nearly all thoughtful and sensitive people discover for themselves at some stage in their childhood. Throughout most of history, it must have seemed utterly convincing, self-evidently true. And yet, as the result of one of the most astonishing intellectual revolutions in history, we now know that it is wrong, or at least superfluous. We now know that the order and apparent purposefulness of the living world has come about through an entirely different process, a process that works without the need for any designer, and one that is a consequence of basically very simple laws of physics. This is the process of evolution by natural selection discovered by Charles Darwin. Here, the teleological argument is an argument that is made and that Dawkins is arguing against, that there is a purpose to this world, that everything that we have in this world is on purpose, and incredibly leading us towards a certain goal. The classic example of this argument is the watchmaker. Person, the argument goes, primitive individual, caveman, stumbles out of his cave one day and finds a Swiss watch on the ground. How it got there, we don't know. And the caveman, in his simplicity and in his just basic low-level understanding of his world and his universe, looks at this watch and sees the very small parts and pieces and the cogs and the wheels and the precision and the balance and everything that goes into a modern-made watch. And he says to himself, if there exists such a watch in this world, then there has to exist a watchmaker. Famous argument. If a watch exists, there has to exist a watchmaker. And this argument was presented into our world. If you take a look at our world with oxygen, with waterfalls, with beautiful rivers, trees, and a habitat made just so. It's all perfect. It fits together so delicately, precisely. It's no different than a sophisticated watch. And therefore, a person has to say, there is a world, there has to be a creator of that world. And throughout most of history, that was an accepted argument. And Richard Dawkins comes along and says, not necessarily, not necessarily. We now know that there was a Big Bang. And who says that there has to be a designer? Who says there has to be a designer? But fascinatingly, we have very different answers against this as well. I'd like to read out to you a passage by Amir Akzel. And he has a book titled Why Science Does Not Disprove God. Allow me to read you a very important passage. But has modern science from the beginning of the 20th century proved that there is no God, as some commentators now claim? Science is an amazing, wonderful undertaking. It teaches us about life, the world, and the universe. But it has not revealed to us why the universe came into existence, nor what preceded its birth in the Big Bang. Biological evolution has not brought us the slightest understanding of how the first living organisms emerged from inanimate matter on this planet, and how the advanced eukaryotic cells, the highly structured building blocks of advanced life forms, ever emerged from simpler organisms. Nor does it explain one of the greatest mysteries of science. How did consciousness arrive in living things? But much more important than these conundrums is the persistent question of the fine-tuning of the parameters of the universe. Why is our universe so precisely tailor-made for the emergence of life? This question has never been answered satisfactorily, and I believe that it will never find a scientific solution. For the deeper we delve into the mysteries of physics and cosmology, the more the universe appears to be intricate and incredibly complex. Why did everything we need in order to exist come into being? How was all of this possible without some outside power to orchestrate the precise dance of elementary particles required for the creation of all the essentials of life. The great British mathematician Roger Penrose has calculated, based on only one of the hundreds of parameters of the physical universe, that the probability of the emergence of a life-giving cosmos was 1 divided by 10 raised to the power of 10 and again raised to the power of 123. This is a number as close to 0 as anyone has ever imagined. The probability is much, much smaller than that of winning the Mega Millions jackpot for more days than the universe has been in existence. The incredible fine-tuning of the universe presents the most powerful argument for the existence of an immanent creative entity we may call God. Lacking convincing scientific evidence to the contrary, such a power may be necessary to force all the parameters we need for our existence, cosmological, physical, chemical, biological, and cognitive, to be what they are. Incredible quote. Again, this is a book by Amir Axel titled Why Science Does Not Disprove God. I am not going to go any further here. There is so much to delve into in terms of for and against, and there really is a classic argument to be made by atheists on the one hand. You cannot tell me there is a God. You cannot show me a proof. And on the other hand, by those who believe in a God, you can't tell me that he doesn't exist. And unfortunately, these are two arguments traveling down parallel lines that are destined never to meet one another. But much more important, I believe, much more pressing than the question from a purely theological perspective of does God exist, is the next question that Judaism asks. Assuming that yes, he does exist, what does he want from me? How am I supposed to live my life? What does God actually want me to do? And here I want to share with you a passage from Rabbi Jonathan Sax that is exceptionally powerful, that comes from a series of lectures that he gave in London between the years...
Just a moment. Okay, I found this on the web for select shows that he gave in London.
Siri heard me say Sax and thought she heard me say Siri. No, she's now offering me London West End tickets. London's equivalent to Broadway. Yes, that will have to wait another time, Siri. Sorry about that. But here is a lecture series that Rabbi Sax gave in 2001, 2002 on faith. And I'd like to share with you a reading that comes from a transcript of that lecture. I'll share my screen with you again so you can see the text. He says as follows. I therefore want to sum up what I have said. The greatest revolution of Tanakh was not monotheism, but the concept of a personal God. A God who is a person, who is self-conscious, who is the ultimate reality of the personal, telling us that our self-consciousness is not an illusion, not an accident, not an epiphenomenon, but an objective reality because the universe as a totality is personal, because God is the face of the personal on the universe. Creation, from all of those events from the Big Bang through to the millions of years and the gradual coalescence of stars and planets and the emergence of life, culminated in the emergence of self-conscious beings who, being self-conscious, We're capable of imagination, reflection, creativity, choice, and we're also capable of the thing that only self-conscious beings are capable of, which is knowing that we are lonely. Now we see that there is a genuine depth, analogy between God's creation of nature and humanity's creation of society. They are both concerned with the redemption of solitude, with overcoming loneliness. If something is totally alien, so different from me that we have nothing to talk about, then there can be no relationship. And that is why the Torah says there is some commonality. God creates man in his image, in his likeness. On the other hand, if there were no difference, if there were no otherness to the other, there would be no point in the relationship either. That is the only bond. Not power, not dominance, not control, not coercion. Because if you only relate to me because I force you to, then I have not redeemed my loneliness any more than if you were just a computer doing what I programmed you to do. It is only if I allow you the freedom, but we create a bond between us. And the only bond we can think of that honors that is the bond that we call marriage, which is that relationship between two independent beings, each of whom respects the integrity and freedom of the other, who nonetheless pledge themselves in a bond of mutuality, allowing each the space to be themselves, but saying, I will always be there for you. And that is the relationship which Hosea calls Ish, as opposed to the relationship called Baal, God as a power. God as Ish is God as relationship. And here we come to the simple equation in Judaism. Faith is a marriage. That is the only adequate analogy we have for it, and that is exactly what the prophet said it was. Of course, Hebrew has a particular word for this, and the word is brit, or bris, and it means a covenant, a promise. A covenant is a mutually obligating bond between two individuals, usually of unequal power, who nevertheless come together in committing themselves to one another by saying, I will always be there for you. You will always be there for me. And whatever happens, I won't walk away. That is what Brit means, and that is what faith means in Judaism. I know of no more, and he finishes off the piece, I know of no more description of faith, moving description of faith, no more revolutionary description of faith than that of covenant of love between God and the human race. Fascinating passage. So, according to Rabbi Sax, and the truth is, according to so many of the great theologians of Judaism, we're in a relationship with God where he wants us to be able to offer him something. He wants us to give him something, just as he gives us something. This is a relationship of partners. Unequal, yes, to be sure. But nevertheless, partners, where we can be in a partnership with God to be able to offer him something. Now the question becomes, what? What does God want from me? What could I possibly offer him? Doesn't he have everything? And the answer is no, that God doesn't have everything. And indeed, what is it that God wants? Fascinatingly, God wants the one thing that he doesn't have. And that's the freedom and free choice of individuals to be able to act in such a way that we can do justice to being the living reflection of his image here on earth. Again, take a look at this following passage from the Talmud, an incredible passage. The Talmud says as follows. Just get this to be a little bit larger. Here we go. Amalo. This is an incredible story taken from Brachot 28b. Chavchet Amud Bet. Rabbi Yochanan, the great teacher Rabbi Yochanan, is on his deathbed. And as he is there laying on his deathbed, his students will gather around him and they see that he is soon to leave this world. And they say to him, our teacher, Amala, Rabbeinu, Baruchinu. Give us a bracha. Give us a blessing. Before you leave this world, give us a bracha. Sorry. I want to share with you. We're going to come back to Rabbi Yochanan in a minute. Oh, what a cliffhanger. We'll come back to Rabbi Yochanan in a minute. A Gemara in Shabbos. A Gemara in Masechet Shabbat. Take a look at this. This is so important. I'm sorry. I meant to start with this source. Where are we? Here. What is it that God wants of us? To be his living reflection in this world. Says Abba Shaul, just as God is compassionate and merciful, so too you should be compassionate and merciful. As God acts and expresses himself, so too that's how we need to act and express ourselves. The one thing that we can give God, what is it that God wants of us, is to act in a similar way to him. And how does God act? With compassion for others, who is slow to anger, who is forgiving, who clothes the naked, who feeds the hungry, who supports the poor and collects in the downcast and the marginalized. That is who God is. And just as he is compassionate, Mahu Rachum Af Ata, so too you have to be compassionate. Mahu Chanun, just as he is merciful, Af Ata, so too you have to be merciful. Somebody is getting on your nerves, be patient with them. Somebody's upsetting you, annoying you, forgive them. Be long-standing with them. Be slow to anger. Help them, bring them in. We don't throw anybody out. We don't write anybody off. Because God doesn't throw us out and God doesn't write us off. Because if he did, how many of us would be able to stand here and say, I'm going to try and face another day? Would we really merit facing another day? And this brings us on to Rabbi Yochanan. His students asking, Rabbi Yochanan, bless us. Amalo, Rabbeinu, Baruchenu, give us a bracha. We want a blessing. Amalahem, he said to them, Yehi Ratzon, Shetehei Mora Shamayim Aleichem Kamora Basa V'Dam. May it be your will that the fear of heaven should be upon you like the fear of flesh and blood. So in other words, Rabbi Yochanan said to the students that the way you should relate to God, the awe that you have of him, the reverence that you should show him, should be the same type of awe, reverence that you show to other human beings. And the students are looking at one another and they're blinking and they're, seriously? That's our bracha? That doesn't sound like a good bracha. We should relate to God that we relate to others. Amru lo tamidav, ad kan. The students say to him, that's all. I mean, first of all, let's just pause there. You see the chutzpah of the students. It's amazing. He's about to die. These are his last breaths. And they ask for a bracha, and he gives a bracha, and they're like, that's not good enough bracha. That's all you're giving us. That we should relate to God like we relate to people. Amalahem ulavai. And Rabbi Yochanan, being the great teacher, he says, halavai. If only you would relate to God that way. Because guess what? Teida'u, kashadam over avera omer, shalo yireini adam. Because when a person commits a sin, he says, I hope no one will see me. I hope no human being will see me. The only people we are concerned about avoiding when we do the wrong thing are other human beings. But we somehow or other always forget that there's a God that they're watching us too. We have this sense of God as wanting to be in relationship with us. And it's hard, we push him off to the side. We reject him. We don't often take it seriously that there's an opportunity for relationship. What's the purpose of this relationship? What are we supposed to get from it? We've seen what we can give to it, but What is the purpose of a relationship with God? Where is it leading to? And amazingly, this answer is given in the Mesilat Yesharim, classic work of Jewish philosophy, written by Rabbi Chaim Lutzato in Holland, the 17th century. He opens his book with the following words. Why was man created? Man was created solely for pleasure, to delight and derive pleasure from the Shekhinah, from God's presence. And the true delight, the greatest pleasure that could possibly exist, this pleasure is ultimately in the world to come. And it was for this that mankind was created. Now that isn't a cop-out answer. He wants to say that the purpose of us being created was to enjoy ourselves, and the ultimate enjoyment is something eternal, is something spiritual. A person can love all of the T-bone steaks in the world, but after a while, when you keep eating T-bone steaks, how many of them can you actually have and enjoy? Ultimately, you're going to become sick of it. There are certain pleasures and delights that are ultimate pleasures and delights, and that becomes an eternal pleasure, an eternal delight. But I'd like to go on to something even more beautiful, because we have here, and I think it's true of all of us, many different ways into a relationship with God. For some, it might be how the Jewish people have survived throughout history. For others, it's a sense of a personal relationship with God, wanting to be able to give something to God, wanting to be able to really contribute and build something for God. And we come to a beautiful passage by Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, one of the great, truly giants of our people, who passed away a few years ago. And he writes in a very powerful passage. I'll just share for one last time this additional passage of Rav Lichtenstein. He writes as follows. He says, passionate belief has more than one source. It arises from studying Torah, trusting in tradition, pondering the elaborate structure of the world and the vicissitudes of history, and personal experience. I do not believe that we need to choose between these sources. I believe they are all interrelated, interdependent. Within this symphony, some elements dominate, but as a whole, they create the feeling of belief. You do not need to choose only one path. It's an interesting approach. There is not just one path that leads to a belief or even a relationship in God, but rather each and every one of us in our own way will find that relationship, cultivate that relationship, build that relationship. For one, it might be intellectual. For another, it might be emotional. For a third, it might be psychological. For each and every individual, there's going to be something that pushes and pulls, cajoles, and somehow puts us into a relationship where we say, what is it that can build and strengthen my relationship with God? He continues and says, there is nothing of which I am more certain, more convinced, that I experience more deeply, feel more strongly than my faith. There is nothing that the believer feels more strongly than his faith. Not at every moment and not with regard to every detail, but his very bond to the Almighty, this deep internal bond, this exists at all times. It gives man might, fortitude, and contentment. And I want to focus on that last word, contentment. There is a sense of joy that comes from a relationship with God. We don't speak about this often. This is not something that we typically focus on. But the sense of living life with joy, having a sense of simcha in one's life, a simchat hachayim, the joy of being alive, connecting with existence, living in God's world, having the relationship and the ability to say that my life is meaningful. This isn't an accident. My existence, my being is not haphazard. I'm here for a reason. I'm produced in love and I'm sustained by love. and I'm able to create a loving relationship with God, that is something that fills a person, has the potential and the capacity to fill a person with joy and meaning and contentment. He goes on to say, anyone who has lost his existential connection to the Almighty has experienced a complete collapse, a total unraveling. To lose a connection with the Almighty is to lose one's very raison d'etre, to lose the essence of life, and it is catastrophic. If the loss befalls a particular society, woe to that society. What is life without this bond? It's a beautiful passage. And if I can somehow or other wrap up these string of ideas, I'd like to say the following. Oftentimes we think of God as a philosophical construct. We think of God as being out there and we're in here, and not really anything that can touch or connect our lives together with one another. But there's a very different way that classic Jewish sources give towards looking at what our relationship with God can be. And it's a relationship of love. It's a relationship of connection. It's a relationship of closeness. And it's a relationship of wanting us to fulfill the potential with which we have been given here on this planet. We all have a calling. We all have something for which we are uniquely, individually called upon to do. And only by fulfilling and self-actualizing our lives do we grow to the size of the task and challenge ahead of us. And when we self-actualize who we can be, then we can be the force for good in this world. And the truth is, even at times when we are striving towards that self-actualization, we are able to be the force in the world that can bring that joy, that happiness, that love, that care, and that concern to others, and indeed build upon that relationship with God. Our life is a life of relationship. It's possible our lives with God is to be a life of relationship, building deeper and deeper, so that realizing each act we do has meaning. Each relationship we have has meaning. Each interaction we have with our spouse, with our parents, with our children, with our siblings, with our family, our friends, our community, every single moment has meaning. And that meaning builds the world one step closer to being a more beautiful, perfect world. We are here to become the people we can, and in doing so, build up the world so that it reaches ultimately its own redemption, its beatitude, its completion. This is what it means to be able to build a relationship with God. And during these days, we are reminded so beautifully, Dirshu Hashem behimatzah, search out God when he is to be found. Karuhu kashehu karov, call out to him when he is close. Amazingly, the question is, what does that mean? Search him when he is to be found. Call out to him when he is close. Isn't he always close? Isn't he always there to be found? And the answer is that we don't always feel close. We don't always feel like searching for him. And it was on that verse that our sages said, this refers to the period of Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, inclusive. There are 10 days. We can start to feel it in the air a little bit. As we move closer to Rosh Hashanah, we are now, 10 days away, plus minus? We're almost there. As we stand on the cusp of a new year, we can start to feel that God is calling us. And there's an opportunity for us to call out to him. And when we feel that he is closer, because we feel that we are closer, it's an opportunity not to be missed. I wish you good luck in continuing to cultivate and build your relationship with God. And ultimately ask yourself the question that we must all ask: what does he want from me specifically, me literally, me uniquely and individually? And when we figure out that answer, to dedicate and throw our lives in the pursuit of achieving that goal, and if we can succeed, then we can truly shine our light as brightly as possible onto the rest of the world, because they need that light to be shone. You are needed. All of us are needed. And in the process, we can take this world to where it needs to be. Thank you, and have a good evening, everybody.